till 10:45 or so, and so I want to do that and go through some issues related to church revitalization, and so hopefully, thank you, and hopefully encourage in this area. We want to put some practical things into the conversation today. And to do that, I'm going to look to a couple of resources I'll draw from. I'm going to quote some books I've written. I get that, right? But I'm going to let you know that I don't make any money off of them, so this isn't a long pitch or a long sales pitch, any of that sort. But I just want you to kind of draw from some research that we have created about churches that are experiencing revitalization. So this is from the book called Comeback Churches, and it looks specifically at this issue of church revitalization and transformation. And that's my topic for the next 45 minutes. And one of the questions people often ask is, why do you look at churches that have experienced transformation or revitalization? Well, last time I tried to be encouraging through maybe telling that alternative story, looking biblically at what that might look like. Well, today I want to dig a little more in and use some examples and some research and start by asking the question, why do you look at churches that have experienced transformation? Well, the reality is there's a lot of alarming statistics out there. The statistics are alarming, and many churches are flat to declining. Some depending upon the tradition you're in, sometimes it's not just that they're bleeding, but they're hemorrhaging, and it's just a question of trying to find the floor, the bottom, at which point that will stop. And so again, when we tell an alternative story in the midst of that, people see that and they say, okay, this is making a difference. We also wanted to help churches come back after a decline. Mike Dotson and I co-authored this book together, and we're driven by biblical principles. So there's a lot of things you could do to grow a church that wouldn't necessarily be biblical or even helpful. And so we wanted to kind of present things through a grid, through a worldview and a matrix that was biblical, but to learn from the experience of others was central in our idea. We think that the best people to learn from are people who've done what you're trying to do. And so that's who we talk to. In fact, I'm about to release another study in Dallas in just a few weeks at what's called the D6 conference, based on Deuteronomy 6. People often ask, what's the best way to be a parent? And I always think, I have young kids. I'm 43, but I have little children. I have a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 12-year-old. And people will sometimes ask me to teach on parenting because my children are so wonderful. And I always say to them, maybe not me, because at this point, I think anything I say is still theoretical. Until you rear teenagers, you're just talking theory. So what we did in this study is we found 1,000. We surveyed 1,000 parents who had reared children now in their early 20s that loved Jesus and were living mission-shaped lives. We asked them what they did. And so we figured it'd be better to ask somebody who actually did through that journey. Well, that's what we did here with Comeback Churches. And because the big question was, what principles from Comeback Churches could guide pastors and churches down this path of revitalization? So we did that by actually examining 324 churches in an in-depth research project. Some of them received as many as 3 interviews to really look for those that experienced growth after a period of decline, and they increased membership and had increased their baptisms or their conversions, depending upon their denominational tradition. And so here's how we did this study, just to give you a picture of it. We used surveys and phone interviews. First thing we did paper interviews sent to 1,000 of them, asking them to participate, because we gathered the data. We had 11 denominations share with us their data. And so they would say, this church was declining for 10 years and now has been growing for 3 years, and they're experiencing conversion. So we would survey them. Many churches keep good data, many denominations don't, but we had enough to draw from. So we sent 1,000, about 400 or so returned the survey, and then we called. Some of those we thought the data was wrong. There's this very important thing. It's a technical term when you do research surveys. I'll explain to you. It's technical. People lie, and so a lot of times you sort of got to check on them. And they say, at pastors, we call it evangelistically numbering. They're counting, they're counting pets, and they're counting people driving by, they're counting pregnant women twice. And so sometimes there's some not things. So we narrowed it down, and then we ended up with this criteria for a comeback church. Now, here's the criteria. They had to experience 5 years of plateau or decline since '95. We did this survey in 2006. So from '95 to 2000 had to decline, and they had to grow from, say, 2000 to 2005, or it could be from '98 to 2003. So they had to have years where they were stuck or declining. So that is the first criteria. Why? Because we're looking for churches that weren't doing well. That's key. Then they had to follow by a significant period of growth from 2 to 5 years. Now, the reason we didn't say 1 year is they might have, I don't know, a lucky year. I don't know what you want to call it. I probably use that term, but they might have had a year where just, some people got mad at the Lutherans down the street, became Presbyterians, and so there was a revival, and so that lasted a year. So we want to make sure that wasn't the case, and their membership to baptism or conversion ratio had to be 35 to 1. Again, let me explain what that means. In several of your churches, there should be baptized people after they've made a profession of faith. And so in those groups, we would count their baptisms. In groups like we have Presbyterians who are part of our study, and Lutherans as well. And they don't. They would practice baptism. And so for them, they were looking for conversions, new followers of Christ. And so we made it have a 35 to 1 ratio. So in other words, if your church is 100 people, to be in this study, you had to have, in that course of the study of the comeback years, you had to have 100 members, you had to have 3 conversions a year. Now that's going to limit some folks, right? Because some of you say, well, that's not real high. Actually, it is when you do this kind of research. It's very high when you do this kind of research. And then at least a 10% increase in attendance per year. So then we surveyed all these different denominations. The group with the lowest percentage of churches that met this qualification were the Southern Baptists. The group with the highest were the Assemblies of God, and others, Lutherans in the middle, and others in the middle. And it doesn't mean, by the numbers, Southern Baptists were 0.7%. Assemblies of God, they were the highest. They were 1.4%. That doesn't mean that only, say, 1%. 1% was the average. That doesn't mean that only 1% of churches experience revitalization. Because, there's a window here, right? So if they experienced it 6 years ago, they didn't count in our survey. So they could have had 6 great years. So no growing church for more than 6 great years would be in our survey. Why that? Because if you experienced a transformation 10 years ago in your church, you probably just don't remember a lot of it. And we wanted to talk to people who this was fresh, and so we got that 2 to 5 year window. Now, there were some assumptions that really, in the book we call it Chapter 0. Because there's some assumptions that we made at the beginning that we were talking about churches that had certain biblical foundations to what they were. And marks of a biblical church, things like scriptural authority and biblical leadership, preaching and teaching, practice of ordinance or sacraments, some of your traditions, the covenant community, mission. These were normative things that we were looking for. Part of the challenge, and the reason I'm not, identified much with the church growth movements, I'm not anti those guys. They're great. I speak at the meeting every year for the last 5 years. But I'm often identified that because part of what happened with the church growth movement, which was a helpful tool to help people think in missional ways, I think later became often driven by methodological mania. It became nickels, noses, and numbers, and it became too many formulas. Formulas scare me. When you have a formula, you got 7 people, that'll lead to 1 person, which then will multiply with a connection to 2 people, exponentially to the 4th person. And it's like, wow, really? Have you met those people? Because they don't seem to multiply and exponentialize like I thought. Because but there are certain principles. Now, I don't want to think we can't learn, right? I'm a researcher, right? We do research. We have a phrase around where I work, facts are our friends. Now I will tell you that that's not always appreciated in every denomination. And when you start telling the truth, that gets controversial. In my own denomination has been growing for many, many years, but has recently, over the last 3 or 4 years, tipped into decline, a slow decline. Matter of fact, we've had people say, well, we're not shrinking as fast as the mainline denominations, which to me is like bragging to the tallest midget. So tell the truth. It's difficult for people, but I think that ultimately we need to be truth tellers in the midst of that. Now, but part of that truth has got to be, it's not just methodological and numerical nirvana, but there's biblical basis of what a church is, and that matters when you're talking about church revitalization. The missional church is another part of Chapter 0. We talked about it, and we'll talk. I would say this term has been largely used and sometimes abused, both in the evangelical and in the mainline tradition. It's come, to me, it's remarkable to the places that I go, how I see, oh, you are so good at me, thank you. And nice, and a lid. I did like, well, this is what into your denominational traditions to speak on the missional church, because that term has become kind of a lingo thing, and I guess I have one of the better selling books on the subject, called Breaking the Missional Code. But what amazes me is when I go into different denominational traditions, that missional is largely an ecclesiological Rorschach test for people, because the word is not well defined, and in fact Francis DuBose is the first one to use it in the way that we use it today in a book. He wrote a book called God Who Sends in 1983. It was published by my publisher, and thus it was never heard from again. So he probably did wait it. He was the professor of world mission at Golden Gate, that was Theological Seminary. Then Chuck Van Engen in the 1990s wrote God's Missionary People. Some of you may know Chuck from Fuller. But really it was Daryl Guter whose book he edited as part of his project for the Connecting the Gospel Art Culture Network folks. He wrote The Missional Church. And so what's interesting is the missional conversation, interestingly enough, the term started as a term that evangelicals wanted to use to distance themselves from the conciliar missional churches, and that was what Francis DuBose trying to do. But the guy who popularized it, of course, was Daryl Guter. But the difficulty is now it means anything you want it to mean. So if you really think that church should do more social justice, that's missional, right? So it's a Rorschach test. You know what a Rorschach test is, right? It's an ink blot test. You throw an ink on a page, and you hold it up to a person and say, what do you see? If they say, I see a mass murder in progress, you go right to the doctor, right? Because there's something going on, right? It's an ink blot, but what is in your head? You say, well, I see a field with flowers and happy people. It's all good. And so when someone looks at missional, sometimes people say, so I've heard missional is social justice, missional is being culturally relevant, missional is just sharing Christ, and all of those things I think are partly going to be helpful to us, but ultimately we believe that it's basically living as on mission, like missionaries, and joining God in His mission. And that would include things like studying and learning the culture, the context where we live, proclaiming the good news of the gospel, being the presence of Christ, and contextualizing biblical life in church with that culture. Those are issues that we saw and encouraged here along the way. The third thing in kind of the chapter 0 we talked about was the issue of spiritual churches. I want to spend a little time here because I want to talk to you about some of the issues we found that became hindrances to churches experiencing revitalization. Okay? Let me talk about what are some of the barriers. Because I think we start at the spiritual place. Now, I'm assuming the biblical foundation. I'm assuming a missional focus. And if I was normally doing this. Again, I mentioned I'll be teaching. This is part of what I'm teaching at Trinity in March. And so I'll be spending an hour on the spiritual foundation and all this sort of stuff. But our time is short. And as you know, last night the clock goes off. Long, so we won't do that. And besides, John Hull is kind of, this is going to be great. You want to hear John. So they're going to give me 10:45. And so what are some of those barriers? Let me talk about a few. One is, and some of you are taking notes. If you'll go to comebackchurches.com, you can download everything I'm presenting to you right now for free. I'm trying to sell you anything. But and use it in your church if you're so inclined. Self-focused leaders in churches. When church becomes about me and the meeting of my needs, matter of fact, I think it's fascinating. I think that you could preach heresy in most churches in America, and if you had a video clip and you were funny, they'd invite you back. But if you change some things in the church, you change the music, the order of service time, move the chair, you better have the U-Haul warmed up in front of your back. And that tells us that we are more passionate about our preferences than joining God on His mission. And that is to change. Another is sometimes churches are experiencing God's discipline. Your church may be declining because God wants it to decline. And that's a strange thing to consider, but biblically we see this because of Revelation, things about removing the lampstand. And in the midst of that, I mentioned the Church of England in England yesterday, and it's rapid decline. And now there's like these, in the midst of the burnt forest, there are now these shoots of light that are emerging up. Well, some might say there was a great discipline that took place. I don't think we need to underappreciate the fact that God may, in His grace and mercy, say, your church right now doesn't need an influx of new believers, doesn't need an influx of new people. One is the lack of radical faith in alliance. Now, this is an issue that I don't have to talk about as much in low church traditions, but there's one part of it. but the issue of the endowment. This is a huge challenge. If your church has an endowment or a large financial stake somewhere that lets it go on regardless of whether or not you reach people and are obedient to Christ, it can have huge long-term implications. It creates in you a spirit of the Laodicea. We have all that we need. We don't need these things. And that also within denominations as well. But again, even if you don't, if you just have enough to get by, see, when people are not desperate enough, they often don't experience the change that's necessary. And that's why I think that this season in the mainline tradition, the Seven Sisters of mainline Christianity, really is, I'm going to show in just a minute, is an opportunity for you, particularly those who call it the mainline, to tell an alternative story, to in the midst of that desperation, to say, don't look to, this new plan or this new theological system. Let's look back to Scripture. The paleo-orthodoxy that Tom and others have talked about. Let's look to there and to see how that might be transformed. Doing instead of being church. Remember, every religion in the world creates rituals and religious hierarchies so that it might do rather than be. In other words, I can do these rituals, and I got a religious hierarchy that I pay to do these rituals. So every religion in the world does. But the gospel actually changes us and sends us on mission and to live on ministry. Another is watering down the gospel and the truth. Now that won't always. Sometimes that'll grow your church. Now that's unusual. I think there's a certain historic irony that I constantly hear, and I write about this frequently. I wrote about this I did the cover story for Christianity Today last month, and I mentioned some of these issues. That there's always this sense, always this drumbeat. Listen, the world finds us out of step. The world finds us intolerant. And if we just will, and you'll hear it, if we will just change our views to be less intolerant, that all those people who left will rush back in. Right? The young people will rush back in. I always refer to them as the young people, which I think is anyone under 50. And what I would say to you is, sorry, I was close, maybe 55. What I would say to you is that in a great twist of historic irony, is that every time that's tried, those denominations decline faster. It's not how it works. I mean, actually, it's the opposite. It's robust belief systems are what. Let's take out the theological, which is a phrase you're not going to say much. But robust belief systems in religions are what attracts people. And so, what happened? But there are still some. I mean, you can watch on TV and you'll see a preacher who stands up and says, "This is my Bible," and then never refer to it again. And so there's a certain sense that attracts people. And so there can be an attraction to that. I wasn't referring to anyone in particular. That's the medicine. There's some others. Distracted from our first love. Ineffective disciple making is a key issue. Irrelevant ministry. I often say in my denominational family that if the 50s come back, we are ready to go. But we don't live there anymore, so how's that ministry relevant in this context? No, I think there's a danger, and I get that danger. I see churches chasing after relevance, and there's a danger in that. And some of you, particularly, I know ECOT, some of you are not going to like even the phrase relevance, because the irony is that's the phrase that many mainline denominations use to say we want to be relevant, and what they ended up doing is changing the theological system. And I get that's it. But what I'm saying is that biblically, I think that churches need to be, I'll give you three things on the screen: biblically faithful, culturally relevant, counterculture communities for the kingdom of God. That's a big thing I write on. You read my blog at Stetzer.com, you can look up that. They need to be biblically faithful, and the authority of God's word shaping a ministry life. Biblically faithful, culturally relevant. We should look similar to the world, but live radically different than the world. Ironically, what we often do is do the opposite. We actually look different than the world. People go to our churches, and it's sometimes like a trip to a museum. So we look different while we live exactly the same, statistically. And I think the scriptures would teach us the opposite, is to look similar, not identical, right? I got 3 daughters. We talk about not dressing like the world. We have very strict rules and rulers to enforce them. So we're going to look similar, but live culturally relevant counterculture. So it looks similar but lives different. There's the counterculture element. Counterculture communities for the kingdom of God. And lastly, one of the things that hinders is the issue of pride. I don't want to change. I love this. I love this too much. I was speaking to at a gathering of an Anglican offshoot group of the Anglican Mission in America. Had the privilege of keynoting their annual meeting. I guess I'm doing it again this year. Good people, and you know, there are different kinds of people, but one of the things that marks this lifeboat Anglicanism, some might call it, is a commitment to preserve orthodoxy. And so I was speaking to a group, and I spoke in the main session, and just got up there and, you know, kind of waved the Bible around and yelled. And then the second session I spoke at was a breakout session. There were about 200 people there, and it was about church planting. This is a group that's now, they're part of the Anglican 1000 initiative under Archbishop Chuck Murphy, and it's part of the North American Convocation, which is in Dallas. And so, but during this breakout session, I had a complaint from a person in the audience, and which is all good. I'm not hardly offended by that. But I was describing ways that we plant churches, and I was talking some about this issue of engaging culture, and again, I'm not an Anglican, but what I say to people, when I say to Anglicans and other people, like some Lutherans who might be here, when I spoke to the synodical leadership of the Lutheran Church of Missouri Synod, what I said to them is, we both believe in truth, and we both believe in tradition. But my church, being a low church evangelical, we have a little T tradition. But in your tradition, so many of you here, there's a big T tradition. There's a tradition that's part of that Jude 3, faith once delivered to the saints. My people don't generally believe that. But I recognize that when I speak to my Anglican friends, that there's a tradition that's passed on, the exercise of the Eucharist. And so what I was doing was talking to them about the necessity of holding to what they believe. Not necessarily something I share, but I think it's important that if you believe this, if you believe that the exercise of the Eucharist in this certain way, at this certain time, with this certain frequency is normative in the life of the church, that's a big T tradition for you. In other words, it's a passed down tradition, a Jude 3, faith once delivered tradition. I don't have to agree with it to not appreciate it. And so I was saying to them, so if you're going to plant churches, remember I'm training 200 or 300 of them to plant churches, you're going to take that big T tradition, but it's going to be lived out in a little c culture, in a cultural context. And so I began to give some pictures of that, what that might look like in an arts community in Louisville, Kentucky, and actually explained one time. I went to a church there in Louisville. One of my students, I was a professor there, one of my students had planted a church. Still there, the name of the church is Sojourn, and Andrew knows Sojourn, and good to see Andrew, one of my former students, by the way. Were you a student or was your husband a student? You were, okay, good deal. But you were the smart one, we remember. And Andrea and Perry were part of a church planting team we did locally, but Sojourn was planted, and I had the privilege of they asked me to preach there when I was running about 200 people. They met in this old oak cathedral-like place. They rented it Sunday nights, and it was all artists / waiters. And it's the Highlands of Louisville. It's the art and croissant community of the town. It's just neat. If you've ever been to Louisville, it's a neat part of town. And so I asked me to preach there. And I came in, I was 37, I would guess, at the time. And I walked in, and I was immediately noticed I'm the oldest person in the room. There are 200 people. They're all artists. They all wear black. I mean, all black. You got tats here and there. The band was on the stage, and I immediately noticed that one important thing, that the music was entirely too loud. Now, this was a shocking moment to me, because I had been a church planter. I planted 5 churches up to that point in New York and Pennsylvania. And I've heard the phrase, "Pastor, that music's too loud," literally hundreds of times. And I have said to people, I've thought to myself hundreds of times, and said out loud a few times, if it's too loud, you're probably too old for our church. But there appears to be an age when you switch sides on this issue. And so I'm like, that music's too. And they were up there. I didn't know any of the songs because they're all artists. They write all their own music because it would be sold out to the man. And there's 6 of them. They're warming up, and they all have black T-shirts. They're all 23, right? They got black T-shirts, jeans with holes in them, hard sneakers, blonde highlights in their hair, and big, thick black be squealing. I told this Anglican group, said, to me, like all the facial jewelry people had little hooks and stuff, and chains that went through. But I want to just pull them and say, is that real? It looked like half the church had fallen into a tackle box. I can read them in there, what I'm talking about. And so I'm saying all this, and I'm saying that now in that community, in this, golf is too strong of a word, but in this golf-friendly art community, I'm saying these Anglicans, I said, you're going to practice your Big T tradition, but it's going to look very different than the way you practice it in, Connecticut, with Buffy and, Muffy and and it was as if, at that moment, I saw this man in the back, he just started red. It's as if I cut the head up of a goat and put it on the altar. Puts up his hand. He's like, I'm not really taking questions yet, but his hand is He said, we didn't leave our church so we could compromise on the way that we do church. And I said, well, let me ask you a question. What part would you consider compromise? And he said, well, the way people dress, what they sing. I said, okay, so in your tradition, let's say we're using the 1928 prayer book. Would that be okay? You can't do that and do this here. So there's no singing and there's no, actually there is. So we had this conversation, and I say to him, nicely, because, I'm kind of like, it was this awkward moment. He says, I want my church the way it's supposed to be. And I felt a little sorry for him because I knew that night, because AMIA, Anglican Mission America, is under the jurisdiction of the Rwandan primate. And so I knew that night we were going to have worship, and the leader of his whole movement was going to lead worship that night. And there was one huge problem, is that he was African. And it's not so much the problem of being African, it's not a race issue we're talking about here, but it's a cultural issue. Because I knew this guy, this was his first day, right? I just did a little preaching in the morning, and he's going to walk in, and the capital T truth is going to be there. But he's proud more of the way that he does church than the faith once delivered to the saints that has to be lived out. And thus, I challenged him, I said, listen, hey, I said, you're going to have a hard time tonight in the service. And he began to think, and he said, oh, yeah. And here's what I said. I said, a biblically faithful Anglican church should look different in Singapore, in Senegal, in Selma, Alabama, and in Seattle. Where should it be the same? In what it believes, right? There should be, or else then basically we've just completely accommodated to the culture and the context. But what has to happen is that we don't put our pride in the way that we do church beyond the marks of a biblical church. But the problem is people are programmed culturally, you and me, we are programmed culturally to equate meaning with form. So, for example, you sang some songs, right? And I can tell we were tracking together. We're singing here. I couldn't sing much because all I got is his voice right now. But we were kind of, I'm guessing, similar in age, and I grew up in the renewal kind of chorus songs. But the reality is that if I go somewhere else, that's not the music we're going to sing. And pride causes you to bring the form, not to bring and live out the biblical meaning in different contexts. And so ultimately, spiritual churches are not driven by pride. So at the end, the question is, why become a comeback church? Well, I got passionate about this when I was little. I was a professor at that seminary there, and teaching church planting. And I taught admissions and evangelism as well. And I got a phone call from a church across the river in Jeffersonville, Indiana. Now, it's just a suburb of Louisville. It's another state, but it's just an accident of geography. And yes, got across the bridge. And they said, Dr. Stetzer, they call me Dr. Stetzer for a day. And they said, Dr. Stetzer, we want you to come over here and help us reach the young people. And that is how they refer to their community, as the young people. That's a bad sign, by the way. And they said, we got to reach the young people, and they asked me to come over. And so I walked into the church, and the church sat. If we kind of had the main area here, not the size, this is about the size of the sanctuary maybe. It's at 300 people. And it was founded, the church was founded in 1952 by Jimmy Carter. Not that one, but it would have been cool. And it had been hundreds. But then since the 70s, it had been on this slow decline. And I later would chart it out, and I charted out, so here's where we're at, and we can look, we can see where, I mean, the line clearly points to dissolution about 8 years from the time, if the current trends continued, 8 to 10 years. And at that moment, I walked in, and they were all seated sort of over here, where you folks are seated, and there were 35 of them left. All senior adults, well, one was, but there was, the median age of the church was 68 years of age. They had a guy named Greg. He was my age. He was 40. They called him the youth group. And it was like there was an oxygen tank or a walker at the end of every pew. And they said, Dr. Stetzer, you got to help us reach the young people. Well, I got to tell you, this is not what I do at this point, right? I'm not afraid of all those, early 30s, I guess. And all I've done is plant churches. I moved to the inner city of Buffalo, New York at 21. I know it's something weird in some of your policy, but I went and just started planting a church. That's all I've ever known. And so we go home, my wife and I, we pray, and God just puts on our heart that we're supposed to go lead this church, right? Now I'm still the professor at the seminary, but kind of in that, a lot of professors will go out and pastor, and so I did. So I became, and we were going to walk this journey together, and it was a remarkable journey. I fell in love with senior adults. Pastor, listen, senior adults are not a problem, they're a partner. You just got to bring together, that's what leadership is. And so we, it was funny because I said, so we had meetings. We had a lot of meetings. So what do you want to do to turn this thing around? And Mary, she was very vocal. She said, preacher. They called me preacher from then on. One day I got Dr. Stetzer, now I was preacher. And they always say, preacher, and with a finger. And I never knew if that was bad or good. It was like, preacher, why a sermon? Preacher, you're a bad person. I never same beginning. Gave me the finger and the word, preacher. So Helen said, preacher, we just got to go contemporary. And that's how she called it. Contemporary. It's like 6 syllables. We just got to go contemporary. That'll reach the young people. And I was in a meeting. We used to have these Wednesday night discussions. And I said, Mary, I'm not sure that we would survive a transition to contemporary. She said, no, it would be fine. I said, no, I mean literally people might die. And so we kind of developed a plan to walk through. And the plan was, one of the first things we do is we had lost our love for our community. And so one of the first things we do is I was going to send them out to meet people in the community. Now my people, like your people, they don't want to go out and go knock on doors. And the standard evangelical pickup line for the last 50 years has been, hey baby, if you were to die today. I'm sending out a bunch of 68-year-olds into a lower middle class, blue collar, multicultural neighborhood. Just in the scenes, and that was, I don't think they go. And so we took a more informal basis. But I bet you could, some of your folks do. What we did is I gave them clipboards. I love clipboards. And I said, we're going to go door to door, and we're going to just ask these questions. Why do you think most people don't go to church nowadays? Now they're going to answer why they don't go to church, but we're going to know why is this. The other question was, one of the other one was, what do you think about Rolling Field? That was the name of our church, Rolling Field. What's your perception of Rolling Field? So I trained them, said, has everyone got it? Yeah, everyone got it. So we took a Wednesday night. Right? We just going to go, we met for prayer. We had church, in our tradition, we have church on Sunday morning and Wednesday night, because it's in the Bible, 2 Opinions, chapter 4. So we start going door to door, and Harold is the 88-year-old chairman of deacons. Now that would be the equivalent of your vestry or your session or your PPR, whatever it may be. And so Harold's there, and Harold's like, I mean, just this stalwart. I mean, so he never talks, but when he does, everyone listens. So Harold and I are on one side of the street. We're just walking down the street, and Nora and Hazel are over on the other side of the street. And it's a narrow street, and so suddenly we're just walking up our sidewalk, but Nora and Hazel get there first, and we hear this loud banging. And so Harold and I turn around and immediately know there's trouble because Nora has her cane and she's using it to bang on the door. And this young Latino male throws open the door, right? You must tired, they were driving in. Maybe you can relate to that in your own churches. And so we said, what are we going to do? And we said, we got to create a plan. I'd never done this before. I started reading all these books on church modelization. And I said, we've got to get a plan. And so we discussed, are we willing to make some change? Change is hard. Everyone hates change. But you can't do the same thing, same way, expect different results. We've all heard that. It's been credited in every group. So we had this discussion, and it went on for a while. It was kind of interesting because there was one lady, I'll call her Alice, who she hated me. And still does, actually. If you don't, let me say, be pastors and leaders, if you're experiencing church mobilization and at least 10% of the church is not mad at you, you're really not doing much. People just get mad at you when you lead change. Now, if 60% of the church is mad at you, you might want to tone it down. It's sort of a mid-range point where transformation is going to require that. So we started talking back and forth, and one of the things we decided to do is we've got to experience some change. So we decided, I said, why don't we do this? Why don't we cancel church for 2 weeks? And why don't we go visit churches that are reaching people like we want to reach? Because by now they begin to care for, we've got to do something to reach people in the community. So let's cancel church. And then, what did I say the name of the lady didn't like this? Alice. I don't want to use her really. Alice was not happy ever. But anyway, so I suggest let's cancel for 2 weeks. I got a list of 5 churches that were reaching people like ours. I think 3 from my denomination, 2 outside. I said, let's go visit them for 2 weeks. And Alice said, we wrapped the conversation. She said, preacher, what if somebody shows up the 2 weeks we're gone? I said, Alice, no one's shown up for like 6 years. This is it. This is the rush time. Take over the church. I said, I'll stay behind. And so I sent out these folks, and mainly little sweet ladies, because when you're median age of 68, it's about 2/3 sweet ladies. Well, 2/3 ladies, and a good percentage of those were sweet. Alice in there. Anyway, Alice. So finally we sent them out, and it's funny. You actually download this at Comeback Churches, right? So the form. So I sent them out, and their job was to observe the churches they visited, and they write down what they saw, and because they kind of went in packs, clumps, right? And so I had to warn the pastors because you have all of a sudden like 6 senior adult ladies move in together, and I tell them, what's it look like in the bathroom? So 6 of them go to the bathroom with clipboards, nursery with clipboards. It's kind of like the health inspector has senior adults to come check the church, pack. But they went through and it was fascinating because I brought it back again on that Wednesday night. The first Wednesday night we didn't want to talk about it. The second Wednesday night I said, what do you think? And Mary, she's vocal. She's the one who said, we got to go contemporary. Mary stood up and she said, just right at the beginning, said, what do you think? She said, preacher, the church has changed and nobody came and told us. We were a traditional church, and there's nothing wrong with that. My preference is probably more traditional. I think because I've planted contemporary churches, I tend to like traditional. I think that's, I'm a child of the contemporary church movement, so I want to go to a church that's more traditional sometimes. So I listen to my CD right now. I've got hymns. I love hymns with pipe organs and trumpets. I like to crown him with many crowns. But there are 2 kinds of traditional worship. It's a technical distinction, but it may be helpful. Good and bad, and we were bad. so we, I don't know all that, but it was, it was pretty bad. I'll tell you one thing. My favorite thing was one day we had the guy who was the music leader, called Bob. He's not there anymore. But we'll call him Bob. But Bob was, when you're elected the music leader, by the way, it's an elected position, not a skill-based position. That's a great sign. And so Bob would lead the music, and he would wave his hands. I don't know if your church does. Some traditional churches do this, and they get on. But what was interesting, he had seen somebody do it, but he didn't realize that the movement of the hand has something to do with the rhythm of the song. So to him, it was a constant repetition. All right, everybody, let's sing. And one day he did a children's sermon. That was his job. But children's sermon was like my kid and Greg's kid. And so they come up that day, and my kid at the time, I just was Greg. But anyway, I'm sitting on the front row, and Bob in the Old Testament there were some kids, and they're bad kids. And they made fun of a man for being tall. And God sent the bears to eat them. And the kids are... And he ends with the moral of the story. It's all labels here, you know. People make fun of people, and God will punish it. With bears, it appears. Cancel that. So anyway, so we had this long discussion and lay out some ideas. Here's what we can do. We can reconsider our worship. We should reconsider our mission, our ministry. Say, you know, I got a job across the river. I'm not hurt if you don't want to do this, but if you want me to help you, let's walk this together. I won't impose anything on you. In my tradition, we're congregational, which probably creeps on me out. But I'm telling you, when it comes to church civilization, every church is congregation. Because you've got to get people to buy in, or they're going to vote with their feet. And so in my case, I made them vote on everything. I mean, I wore them out. We had at one point 6 weeks of consecutive business meetings. They begged me for no more votes. It's a deal, we'll vote next year. And so we just sort of created an annual kind of thing. But we had this discussion. And the key moment was, this went on for, I don't know, it was probably our longest meeting. We said, could I lay out a plan? And they said, yeah, we want to do it. And here's how it ended. Everyone bought on board when Harold stood up, right? Everyone's back and forth. And Harold stands up and he says, preacher, in 20 years, we'll all be dead and gone. This church will be closed. And Hazel said, it ain't going to take 20 years for you, Harold. There used to be a filter that sort of goes. Yeah. Your grandma, yes, let her say whatever. And Harold said, shh. And here's what he said. That's all because I quoted him in the book. That's all I tell people all around the country. We don't want our church to die. We'll do what it takes. It's at that point. And part of the challenge is that there often is a point of desperation that leads to that inspiration. I've got to, and this is, and I know it's like, oh gosh, Ed, you know, some of the main lines are there. Yes, they are, and that may be why God has left you, kept you, and has sent you here where you are today. Because I think that when you look at a church, that there's levels of change that are necessary based upon the situation where we find ourselves. Maybe a church is stagnant, and needs to clear focus now. It's not a big change. But look, I mean, some of you have to go, I mean, it's near death. To restart it with new leadership or become a new church is key. And so the more change, less change is going to be key. But the openness to change is going to often be largely driven by the openness of the people to that change. Remember we mentioned pride. If people are proud of who they are, they won't become who they need to be. Say that again. If people are proud of who they are, they won't become who they need to be. And so the necessity of leading people through that process is key. And so, and I want you to hear this. Many of you stood, and I talked about yesterday, that standing firm is good, but going on mission and standing firm is better. Because I think what sometimes happens is that we kind of assume that we have stood and we have theological fidelity and faithfulness, and praise God for that, but we've assumed that would lead to missional action. But what we talked about last night is that the normal posture are passive spectators rather than active participants in the mission of God. So you've got to tell that alternative story that we talked about last night. But to lead through church civilization requires leadership. Now, right now, it seems that these things go ways. In the 80s, everyone was quoting John Maxwell like he was the 4th member of the Trinity. I mean, it was just constant John Maxwell quotes. And the thing about John Maxwell quotes is they all rhyme, so they're easy to say. Right? You can't have the dream unless you have the team. And so, but now I think we're sort of there's a backlash in some circles against some of that CEO leadership. And I'm not a big fan. But I bet, how many of you have read a John Maxwell book? It doesn't matter what one. They're basically the same book written 17 times. And John Holder, John Holder's going to yell at me. But here's what I would say. And by the way, I buy them all. And when we look and we surveyed these pastors, and we said, what was the key? And they said, new leadership. Sometimes it was that. What was interesting was 60% of the churches experienced revivalation when a new leader came. That can be discouraging. New pastor. What was interesting to us was the 40% that didn't. So we actually called them back all told 3 times to get more and more information. And there was a recurring theme. The recurring theme is that the church has a new leader. That new leader was just me. And you know the number one person they cited to help them to develop their leadership? John Maxwell. by the way, we're not just the number one Christian leadership guru in the world. When they do surveys, it's the number one leadership guru in the whole world, in all surveys and categories. And so this leadership thing is key. And when you're going to, slide, you don't get that one. But you can download it online. So what staging comeback? Let me just share a few principles, and I'll close with an illustration. First, in staging comeback, the people have to be part of the turnaround. You know, again, the quote Maxwell, right? I will phone them. The quote: "You can't have a dream unless you have a team." Another Maxwell cliche is not just from him, but that I got from him, is everything rises and falls on leadership. We found that to be the case. So that 40% we asked, we said, what happened? Well, I became a new leader. And so there's what we found is that 100% of churches that experience revitalization after a period of decline had a new leader. The only question was it a leader who changed or a leader who came in as part of a change? I think that's key for us. Acts 6, think about the problem we have with the distribution of with the widows, the Hellenistic and the Hebraic widows. And they brought the people and said, we got to figure this out together, telling the alternative story like I talked about last night. The second thing is decide on a course of action together. Wow, I think I've got PowerPoints from the 90s. Look at that. You gotta love those graphics. The 90s called, they want PowerPoint back. They decided a course of action together. Here's what we're going to do. I don't have time to walk you through what we did, but we did a worship experiment. We redid the way we did church, and there's so much to make that happen. But that was the key. And finally, it requires proactive leadership. Proactive leadership. We should never, in the body of Christ, be anti-leader or leadership. These things pendulum swing back and forth, and I think it's unhelpful. And I do get that perhaps maybe in the 90s it was just too much CEO, we all wrote against that, et cetera, but the answer is not to throw out universal principles of leadership when the church so desperately needs them today. 1 Timothy 3 says that the job of an overseer is a noble task. It's a noble thing. And for you to lead people to revitalization is going to require you to not be afraid of exercising that leadership, and proactive leadership is the key. Let me show you a few things, and I'll close illustration. Comeback leaders took the initiative for change. Didn't wait and say, maybe revitalization will come. If I just keep preaching, I'll preach our way into revitalization. No. Took the initiative, said, how are we going to do what God has called us to do? Challenged excuses. Leadership is often saying, it's not acceptable to be dead, struggling, dying. Praying, Matthew 9, 38, about seeing the harvest. Matter of fact, seeing the harvest itself is part of that. John Knox said of Scotland, give me Scotland or I die. I think we've got to love our communities the same way so we see them and we're passionate about them. Modeling evangelistic passion ourselves. Remember I told you last night, you cannot lead what you do not live. We got to reach people in our church, then you and I got to reach people in our church. Share the ministry with others. Become an equipper, not just a doer. Make choices, often better choices, about how I invest my time. These are actually things we talked to from the pastors. The pastors told us they gave away non-ministry tasks. They used their time intentionally. Spent more time on the people stuff, particularly two groups, by the way, leaders and the lost. They spend more time with their leaders and more time with the lost. Communicating a clear and compelling vision. Oh, well, look at that PowerPoint. Love that. You just want to do that again, don't you? Make sure I take those out later. And lastly, comeback leaders multiply themselves. All healthy things multiply, including leadership. Let me close with this. I have funny shaped feet. I know that's an odd segment, but stay with me. Take my shoe off. I wear the same shoes forever because of my funny shaped feet. You can actually see the shape of my right here. I have a bone on both of my feet that sort of stick out. In fact, I'm going to break a pen for a second. You'll never want it back. But one of the things I just discovered recently was actually this bone has created a new opportunity for me in the shoe. So just right in there. Thank you. That's for you to use as anytime you'd like.
I'll never watch that.
Yeah, you never watch it. You'll throw it away. But so I had these and both of them. I told the story once, and the podiatrist said, "Let me snip that bone right off for you." I'm like, "Whoa! Don't say that phrase about my feet." So they're kind of creepy. I don't really have an Aquaman, So when I get new shoes, I'll wear these shoes forever. I just found out like 2 weeks ago that I have a hole here. It doesn't matter to me because these shoes have been worn in right there in that spot. When I get new shoes for 3 weeks, they bleed, I get blisters, I wear Band-Aids until I break in a spot. This is comfortable. I don't want to change. So what happens is, I live in Nashville now, and springtime is there. I got a hole. I got a hole in my shoe. And then summertime will come, and I'll have like a hole in the bottom of my shoe, like the size of a quarter. You can replace the heel, but I'm then fall will come, and it's like maybe or summer will come, and I'm walking on like I got 3/4, and then fall will come. It's like I'm walking on sock, right? I'm just gelling with my Magellans. I got inserts. And then winter will come, and I'll be walking outside. I'll step out of my office downtown, and there'll be a puddle of freezing cold water, right? And I won't see it, and I'll step into it, and there's no shoe to keep the water out, so the water shoots up around my sock and stays inside. So imagine, you just put your hand in freezing cold water. Imagine it hurts, and I'm going, oh. Now my wife has been making fun of me in her very sweet way for months about my holy shoes. She says, honey, go get some new shoes. But it'll hurt. And I'm like, I'm whining. And so, but then at that point, this hurt. I take my shoe off, I rip the sock off just to get the freezing cold water out. And then I go change my shoe. Here's the principle. People never change until the pain of staying the same grows greater than the pain of change. And I think the principle for you and me is to lead our people to hurt for the right things. In other words, some of you need to be a pain. Some of you, that's just natural. But the kind of pain I'm talking about is this. If you raise your hands. Is to help your people hurt for something more than nominal Christianity that cares about its preferences more than its mission, that thinks passive spectator is more important than active participant in the mission of God. We lead them through that process, and we unpack that more. And you can download all that stuff. All the details is at our comebackchurches.com. I think ultimately it changes everything. If I'm at a little flexibility, so I'll take one more minute. When I left the church 2 years later, Harold was 90. On my last day, I was transferred down to my mission agency in Atlanta, Georgia. So I was leaving the church, leaving the seminary, leaving the church. And Harold comes up to me on the last day and he says, "Preacher?" He pokes me in the chest. He physically assaults me. Break your hip. What are you doing? And so he says, "Preacher, I still don't like the music." And he says, "The kids are breaking everything." You know the difference between churches with children and churches without children? Bases. Right. It's in the corner of every room with no children. There's a table, one of those angle tables, like a half table, and a white doily and a beautiful vase with really dusty plastic flowers. You know what you're talking about. You got one in your church. And when there are kids, the table's still there, the doily's still there, but there's a dust stream where the vase used to be because some kid knocked it over. Now, I said, Harold, it's my last day. There's cookie and punch downstairs saying goodbye. Big banner. Thank you, Pastor Ed. So he kind of fingers literally looking at me. I look in his eyes. He has tears in his eyes. And he says, "But it was worth it all." It was worth it all. If the book was around then, I would suggest he read "Who Stole My Church" by Gordon MacDonald because he loved it. And what happened was his son. When we on Easter Sunday we made some major changes. We don't have time to go into made some major changes, and we invited the community in. And by that time we'd grown to 45 or so. Well, on Easter Sunday, 211 people, including his son. And what was interesting was the week after Easter, 100 people were still in church. So we doubled in those 2 weeks. And 2 years later, we had 175. The median age had declined to 35. Nobody left mad except, what was her name? Alice. Oh, Alice left mad. And still to this day is torturing the pastor of another church in town. And some of the folks have died since then. They've gone on to be with the Lord. But for me, Harold, it was worth it all. And it was because they got passionate about joining God in his mission. They told the alternative story. And that church experienced revitalization locally